True and official introduction. I'm Dane Botes. I'm director of the Center for Latin American Studies, and it's my pleasure to invite you to the first of this year's Latin American Briefing Series. The Latin American briefings are typically on current events. They are extraordinarily varied. They're sitting in the audience people who have delivered briefings lectures before. It's my great pleasure to introduce this event, and also to introduce my colleague Emilio Curi from the Department of History, also director of the Center for Mexican Studies, who will introduce this evening's speaker.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming here. It is really, truly, I think all of you know, a special occasion, maybe sadly so, that it is a special occasion where we can have a speaker, professor or whatnot, who actually comes from Cuba, because the state of intellectual exchanges between Cuba and the United States is still rather limited. And so one must sometimes celebrate as if they were coming not from a place that is in the end not very far, but from another galaxy altogether. So it's with great joy that we welcome today Rafael Hernández to the University of Chicago. Rafael is a distinguished intellectual and author of numerous books on a wide variety of subjects, many of which have to deal with Cuban-U.S. relations, but also a wide array of other topics. He directed a series of important institutions in Cuba in the 1990s, and has for the last several years been in charge of the Revista Temas, probably the preeminent journal or magazine in Cuba that deals with debates associated with the social sciences and the humanities, and truly a space of remarkable discussion. I don't know, I think it says, or I should also say that Rafael is here in the United States this month as a Mellon visiting professor at the University of Texas in Austin, and he has also held visiting professorships in other universities. Most recently, he was the Robert Kennedy visiting professor at Harvard University a few years ago. Now, it says something about the state, which hopefully will change, of U.S.-Cuba relations, that there are always questions raised and suspicions aroused, around this issue. So from a Cuban end, people might wonder, well, what kind of scholar intellectual must Rafael be so that the Americans will give him a visa to come into this country? And then from the American end, there are people who wonder, well, what kind of scholar or intellectual must he be so that the Cubans let him go in and out freely whenever he wants? I think one of the, as I said, it's a sad state of affairs that hopefully we are on our way to resolving, that has lasted for way too long, and that has limited and impoverished our understanding of Cuba and of each other. But to go back to what I was saying before, I think it is emblematic of Rafael's ability to speak in both worlds and to be recognized and respected as an important voice in both worlds, that he manages to bridge what has for so long been such a difficult divide. So without further ado, then I'd like to welcome Rafael to the university. His topic today, which promises to be quite interesting, is the Cuban transition, real or imagined, or imagined. I'm not sure which one of the two. It doesn't matter. Rafael will speak, and after that he's graciously agreed to take questions from the public, so hopefully you'll stick around and we'll be able to have an interesting exchange. And once the event is formally adjourned, we will have a small reception in the back of the room where we hope the conversation will continue. So with the hope then finally that this is one of one day will be many events that we can have at the university that hosts Cuban scholars, and in the hope that one day we can have a fluid conversation that is not limited in the way that it is now, we welcome Rafael Hernández to the University of Chicago.
Thank you very much, Emilio. The last time I met Emilio was in Havana. I am so happy to see him again here, and I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for coming. Transition and the Cuban transition is what could be called a hot topic. I did a little research in Google yesterday, and I found 2,240,000 entries for transition and Cuba. I found also that transition and the military had like 884,000, black and black market and transition 781,000, religion and transition 500,000, exiles and transition 432,000, lesbian and transition 416,000, gays and transition 288,000, democratic transition 35,000, Helms-Burton and transition 15,000, capitalist transition 9,650. And I'm just reading a few of these transitions topics. So there's a lot of talk about transition, and in the case of Cuba, there's a lot of talk about transition. And the Cuban transition. There's more written about the Cuban transition outside Cuba than inside Cuba. But there's a lot written in Cuba about changes in Cuba. And since transition is going from point A to point B, that transition is basically a process of change. And since Marxist literature defines transition, socialism as a transitional society, so we have had a lot of ideas and a lot of debate and talks in Cuba throughout half a century about the question of transition. Let me begin by just making a couple of comments on what is not the Cuban transition and how is the Cuban transition imagined. A lot of what you can read in these 2,240,000 Google places is about what the transition should be. It is about prescriptions. It is a prescriptive literature, mostly. Not all, but mostly. It is not describing what a real process going on, but it is describing something that should happen. In other words, you could find most of what you can get is basically about that. It may be more or less articulate, well-informed, long or short, but it is basically about something that should happen. Transition, in general, is something that is going to happen when Fidel Castro dies. This is a premise of most exercises about Cuban transition, the one I call the imagined transition. Transition, according to these sources, is the radical transformation that happened in Chile, in Spain, when authoritarian regimes failed, and in Eastern Europe, of course, and the Soviet Union when socialism collapsed, which is not exactly the same thing. What happened in Chile, what happened in Spain, what happened in Poland, what happened in the Soviet Union are quite different. Because the Spanish economic system and the Chilean economic system didn't change that much. The Chilean society and the Spanish society didn't change that much. What changed a lot were the political institutions. And in the case of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, it was a very radical change of almost everything. So it is impossible to consider that both transitions are talking about the same process, are referring to the same kind of process. The Chinese call their political changes the Chinese transition. That would add another element of heterogeneity. So we have here, nevertheless, when a Cuban transition is mentioned, is basically the kind of transition that would make Cuba pass through changes not like the ones that took place in Chile or in Spain, but like the ones that took place in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And that transition, this is another premise, will bring Cuba back to the Pan-American system. The Pan-American system that was built during the Cold War. Well, the point I want to make here is that there is a transition going on in Cuba that has been going on for the last 15 years, since the early 90s. That involves not only important changes in social diversity, but economic changes, that involve changes in race relations, generation, gender, religious differences, that influence changes in political culture and social consensus. And I want to present the thesis that Cuba is more different than the Cuba that existed 15 years ago, than Spain, compared to the Spain that existed 15 years ago, or Chile 15 years ago. The whole country, the whole society, not just the political system. A second premise that is always assumed when we read about transitions in Cuba is that when democracy returns to Cuba, along with the Cuban exile community, the rule of law and the Cuban economy will be restored. So transition is associated with something like a specific political event, the return of the Cuban exiles to Cuba and to play an important role in Cuban politics. The premises then are that the Cuban exile political culture is a democratic one that inherits the Cuban liberal legacy. So that idea associates the Cuban exile with liberal ideas and with democracy. Cuban exiles will return to Cuba. The other premise is that Cuban exiles, or Cubans who live in the United States, will return to Cuba as soon as a democratic system is restored. The Cuban diaspora will be over and the migration flow will be cut down. Conflict and tensions between Cubans from the two sides and political confrontations will be over, since the main issue, the revolutionary regime, will be gone. And finally, post-Castro Cuba will bring about a transition with general reconciliation between Cuban exiles and Cubans in the island. This is the basic model of the imagined transition. My point here is that political differences based on class, race, generation, and ideological standpoints could not vanish in any future Cuba. Yet, real reconciliation is already taking place. This is not something that is going to happen sometime in the future. But there are thousands and thousands of Cubans that are visiting their relatives. And if you don't believe me, go to the Miami airport, go to Havana airport, and sit there for 3 or 4 hours. and you will see that reconciliation going on in front of you. This is not going to happen when the transition starts. Both power politics and revenge will not contribute to this reencounter. The rule of law should not damage social justice and progress. So we may have the rule of law, and we may have also social justice and progress. And finally, democracy and the rule of law are topics on the agenda in the public sphere in today's Cuba. I try to prove that today, that this is part of Cuban current debate. Why we cannot be compared with Poland, with Russia, with China, with Spain? Because we play this. That's a very important difference, believe me. There's a baseball culture associated. If you use baseball as a social phenomenon, and you look at what is going on in Cuba, you will find many analogies. Transition problems, as well as baseball, concern directly or indirectly to all social groups. This is not something that is happening in the political class. This is affecting everybody. Number two, affect the whole Cuban territory. This is not the capital. This is not the capital always winning. No. This is about the whole country. This is something that is taking place, and the actors playing this drama are all over the country, in every province. Santiago de Cuba won the last baseball series in Cuba, or the previous one. Involve a diversity of actors with their own roles at every level, local, regional, national. Demand a technical expertise. A lot of people don't understand, but soccer is easy. No? Soccer is very easy. Basketball is easy. Even American football is possible to understand. Baseball is very complex. A lot of technicalities. It is a mystery for anyone who don't know or doesn't know the rules of the game. Nevertheless, everyone is an expert in baseball. Here in the United States and in Cuba. Talk to anyone. Anyone have opinions, they know, they have things to say, so this is not something that has been, you say, sequestered? Yes. Is that a word?
Yes.
It's not sequestered by experts. It's something where any ordinary citizen may be an expert, maybe a specialist. This is something important to have in mind when we talk about the debate about transition. This is not about economists, no? I have nothing against economists, of course. Well, is debated critically and openly in the public sphere, more than anything in Cuba. The best example of a public debate in Cuba, even in the party paper, in the Central Committee paper, where debate is not very often, is baseball. On Cuban TV, where debate is not very frequent, they debate baseball. So there's more to be learned from that kind of debate. Critical debate, very critical, real debate, no? With real opposition, opposing views about something they care very much. Well, many of its contradictions are structural and will not go away in its short run, but only temporarily attenuated. There are winners and there are losers. But the rules of the games, as part of the game, is that the very goal of the game is to make it better and to reach a higher standard, even if there are winners and losers in the game. Winners and losers are temporary, not permanent. Roles are a political priority. Baseball is a political priority in Cuba. Fidel Castro writes in the papers about baseball. Not now. but years ago. He was paying attention to that, and all Cuban politicians, and no one could ever think of organizing a big political event at the same time when a baseball match is taking place. There's nothing more important than that. Everybody's paying attention to that. And this is not just for people taking care of sports, but for everybody. Demand the attention of the whole system, including the top level. And finally, although playing the game expresses strong divisions and alignments, eventually contribute to strengthen national unity and national defense, even national defense. The idea of playing a strong baseball and having partisanship. Partisanship is not opposed to the idea of national unity or defending our colors. Believe it. No? Something like this. No? This is very common in Cuba, no? To identify yourself with a specific thing. I was thinking of bringing this hat or the longhorn hat, since I come from Texas, but I was recommended to bring the Cuban one. Well, this, let me tell you, I am going to be very telegraphic from now on. And I thought that it would be better maybe if I have it written for you to read instead of just letting me go by my inspiration. What is the situation? What is the situation in terms of the political debate in Cuba, in terms of the intellectual debate in Cuba, in terms of the debate about changes in Cuba? I will try to do my best in describing the terms of that debate today. The situation. The 1990s crisis brought about a lot of economic difficulties, but not political instability. Main reason is attributed by many to coercion or repression, but the fact is that there's a new political consensus growing out of this new crisis. That is a consensus that is a transformed consensus. It is not a consensus that existed 15 years ago. This is a new one, more complex, more heterogeneous, less unanimous, and pervaded by discrepancies. What were the main economic? I am going to talk about a little bit more about this idea of the consensus that to me is key to understand current Cuba. Economic, social, cultural, and political transformations in these years, no? The transition year. There's a crisis of the Cuban socialist model. There's a clear signs of crisis. Number two, emergency measures that were taken in 93, 94, 95, 96 to cope with this crisis was not a package of reforms, articulated package of reforms that created a new economic and political model. Were like remedies to a critical situation, but didn't rebuild, transform the system into a new one. This is a pending matter. Keeping the political, institutional, and state ideological apparatuses, the media, the schools, social organization, representative and participatory bodies in the polity, that are basically the same, and of charismatic leadership and the instant consensus that was part of that charismatic leadership. Fidel Castro is not ruling Cuba. I know that many of you believe that he is not ruling Cuba, but I have met a lot of people who think that he's still ruling Cuba because he writes in the papers. Growing social inequality as a consequence of the crisis, a combination of the Cuban economic problems and the end of the socialist bloc, the disconnection of Cuba from the socialist bloc, and also the embargo is playing a role. That combination of factors created what I call a perfect storm situation. And this is the crisis. Growing social inequality compared to what Cuba was 15 years ago. Compared with Brazil, there's no social inequality. But compared with Cuba, yes. And that is important. Very important. Lessen confidence and growing uncertainty as part of all this. The fall of socialism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, economic difficulties, the idea of socialism as a welfare society where everybody has the opportunity, have employment, etc., 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 is not that clear anymore, particularly for the younger generations. Finally, changes in political consensus that have not yet been expressed, have not yet articulated a new social pact. A new social pact that could be politically read. New axis of the political consensus. What has changed in the Cuban political consensus in the last 15 years compared to what Cuba was in the 1980s? Number one, agreement about disagreements among civil society actors and between them and politics. Cuban political leaders, Raúl Castro, is not expecting people to agree with everything. This is the premise. And he said so publicly. Social and political shared interest to avoid instability and disorder. No one wants any changes in Cuba that may imply destabilization, disorder, or violence. This is an important element in the new consensus. Try to avoid that instability. Recognition of the need to change the hyper-centralized political and economic order to avoid uniformization, low levels of political participation, and social control. Hyper-centralization has been a problem. It's been there in Cuba for many years. Today is a problem. Today is an obstacle. Today is an object of criticism. It is a target of public criticism. And also the low level of political participation, of real, actual political participation, of people not only participating in mobilizations or participating because they are consulted, but because participating in making decisions and participating in controlling politics. Recognition of the need to restore social well-being levels and to promote new patterns of income redistribution and social justice. So that is also a point of consensus. How to do that? The question is not the diagnosis. This is the point of agreement. The disagreement is about how to face it, what to do, what are the solutions to that. So there is a very large consensus among a wide ideological spectrum within Cuba related to these kind of problems. Identifying these problems are as the main problems we have. And of course that could be the basis for re-articulate an active consensus. Let me talk a little bit more. Let me talk just a few minutes about what are these critical problems and social tensions that are part of the transition, that are part of the Cuban reality. This is not just a debate, this is about the real situation, the structural problems. Number one, the growing inequality and poverty. we have now, according to Cuban sociologists, the estimates in a city like Havana is that there is a 20% of people under the poverty level. This is not poverty as in India. This is not poverty as in Mexico. This is not poverty as in Brazil. This is a poverty where people have social security and they they are not going to die, or they are not because they cannot eat, or they are going to die because they sleep in the streets. But compared to the Cuban standard of living, they are considered under the level of poverty. And this is a problem. This is a fundamental problem. The growing march of poverty on our own terms. Because a socialist system cannot absorb that. As simple as that. As opposed to a capitalist system, these problems are inconsistent with socialism and show basic failures and dysfunction in the Cuban model. Real equality, and when we talk about equality, and sometimes we talk in Cuba about equity, not to be confused, not to get confused with the idea of egalitarianism or with the idea of uniformity. Because people are diverse. There's a diversity of citizens with a diversity of needs. So, but the question of equality is not uniformity, is not egalitarianism. It's a value. It's a moral and political value. And it's a social value. Real equality is a socialist premise and a key value in a socialist system, even if it is just a minority, the poor. Or even if poor citizens enjoy full social security protection, poor people can fully enjoy civilian rights. No freedom or socialist democracy may be developed assuming poverty and marginalization as normal. That's the difference. We don't think this is normal. Most people discussing in Cuba this matter don't think we have to accept 20% of poor people like normal. Well, hypercentralization is a key issue in Cuban institutional order. No democratization. And for democratization is real popular political participation can take place without decentralization. If you read Raúl Castro's speeches, I don't know if you have time or you find easily Raúl Castro's speeches, you will find the term decentralization or problems related to hypercentralization very abundant. No? This is one of the targets of the Cuban leadership today, fighting hypercentralization in a system that's been hypercentralized for a long time. Critical social and demographic imbalances that are part of the Cuban social development. We have more elderly people than ever in Cuban history. There are more people over 60 years old than ever because the healthcare system is good. But at the same time, we have low birth rates because many Cuban women don't want to have more than one children. And sometimes they postpone having children. They are professionals. And professionals don't have 8 children, usually. Largest percentage, growing migration flow. This is not just migration. We have always had migration. But we have now migration affecting particularly professionals and technicians. There's more and more professionals that are leaving Cuba, not only to the United States, but to other countries, and that is a professional drain that is affecting very much Cuban development. And finally, not enough young people, women and blacks in leadership and management positions. We have more young people, more women, and more blacks in top government positions, but they are underrepresented compared to the population. And this is a problem. And this is a problem that is also recognized publicly. So, if you listen to a discussion about that in Cuba, you will find that that has a lot to do with affirmative action. Actual institutional control mechanisms need to be renovated. Bureaucratic mechanisms existing in the Cuban socialist model in the 80s are not working anymore. This is a very complex problem. Maybe it is one of the more complex problems. I don't have time to get into that. If you want me, I could talk a little bit more. If you want to know more about this idea, to me, that is one of the key questions to create a new kind of social control that may be efficient, more efficient, not only in terms of enforcing law and order, but in terms of administrative controls, but allowing more social control and citizen supervision from the bottom. It has to do, this is not just a technical managerial question. This is a question of accountability. This is a political question. Unstable solutions to permanent basic consumption needs. If you talk to a Cuban right now and ask him or her, what are your main problems? What are your main problems in Cuba? They will talk about food supply in the markets, they will talk about transportation, and they will tell you, oh, buses, guaguas, are much better in Havana now. But still, we have problems. We have, ¿qué más? Energy. Well, we don't have blackouts. This is the good news. But still, there is a very pervasive idea or permanent state of emergency about energy. Throughout the summer, we have had that all the time, on the radio, on TV, anywhere. We have to save energy. And it is interesting that energy savers are not the private, but are the private, not so much the state. So a lot of pressure was put on state apparatuses, state bureaucracy to save energy throughout all this last summer. And finally, housing. Housing maybe is the most difficult and critical social problem in Cuba today. No health care, no education, not even transportation, not even food supply. The most critical thing is housing. And in a city like Havana, or in a city like Santiago de Cuba, you will find that a lot. If you visit a town like Cabaiguan, where I was born, there's no housing problems. They are tobacco growers. They have a lot of money. Farmers. They don't have a housing problem. But in the cities, yes, and particularly in the capital cities like Havana and all. Well, besides the weak control and unfulfilled consumption demands, accumulated bureaucratic regulations, too many prohibitions, in Raúl Castro's words, and inconsistency in the state and private markets organization facilitate corruption, administrative corruption, at the low level, at the middle level, at the top level. We have that problem too. Well, the question of that in this particular situation, social and political perception of threat to Cuba's national security, internal order, and social peace, of course, are increasing. More sensitivity about that. a factor that is always there, and is a domestic factor in Cuba, has always been a domestic factor for 150 years, is the United States policy. The U.S. unchanged policy of intervention in Cuban affairs has a counterproductive effect on all problems mentioned above, and make more difficult to expand public and critical debate about them. It is more difficult to talk about democracy because the United States used democracy as a political tool to put pressure on the Cuban government. It is more difficult to talk about civil society. It is difficult even to talk about transition. It is difficult to use a language because it is contaminated politically in the U.S. political discourse about Cuba. And that is making lives, particularly people involved in the political debate in Cuba, making their lives not very easy. And finally, we have cyclones, we have hurricanes, and we have epidemics. And the combination of this global crisis with this internal problem, plus a couple of hurricanes or some dengue hemorrágico around, is again the perfect storm situation. So tensions are not as high as I could suppose they be in a different social context. Well, let me stop here. Democratize, changes in social policy, how to decentralize, what kind of changes should be done. We can get back to this. And I have good news at the end, after this horror story. All of the above is known by the Cuban government. It's known by Raúl Castro, and I know about all the leadership. That is part of the current public debate in Cuba. This open discussion is important. Freedom of expression. We are talking about that. Freedom of expression has expanded in the last 15 years. Critical discussions about everything has expanded, including internet. Many of them are part of the transition and are not going to go away that easily. That are not just the consequence of bad policies. We have good policies, and we still are going to have some of these problems. Will a new socialist policy be able to approach those problems, not through techno-bureaucratic means and solutions from the top, but creating a new space for political participation from below? That is the big question. And if you can always have a pessimistic or an optimistic answer to that. But that is that would be my personal opinion. I am ready to share that with you. Thank you.
Well, so he will be happy to take your questions now. I'm sure there's a lot of them out there, even if I can see them at the moment, but please speak up. And we have a little time for that, so if there are any questions, then...
You have survived my presentation. The last thing that you mentioned, the last thing on your outline, you put in the context, or you presented it as a question, can this be done? Can there be a way to create a new space for political participation from below? And those things also came up when you were talking about your critical problems, how to change hyper-centralization, low levels of political participation, and how to create new forms of social control. And it makes sense, I mean, from what I know about Cuba, and from what you said, yes, those things are major problems. But my question in hearing what you're saying is, in what ways is Cuba moving toward some answers to those critical problems? I mean, you a couple times mentioned speeches by Raul in which he brings up these things, and you say people are talking about them, but is anything concrete happening? I mean, if we can ask a whole huge national system to produce concrete changes, perhaps it's a very slow process, but that's my question. What's actually happening, heading toward these
Well,
goals to solve these problems?
I didn't list the important changes or important political move made by Raúl Castro since he's in the government. I think that the most important change is the decentralization of the agricultural sector. This is not just about agriculture. This is about decentralization. I think that when he gives incentives to farmers, when the government try to transfer land not just to private hands but to cooperatives, they are changing from a state-centered economic system to a more cooperative, social-centered economic system. I think that this is an important step in that direction. There are symbolic measures, like, for instance, all Cubans can buy a cell phone. All Cubans can buy a room in a tourist hotel. All Cubans can buy internet, get a subscription to internet. That's good, no? I think that all that is important, but I think that in terms of improving the standard of living of people, socialism is not just about the very nationalist, patriotic, and egalitarian ideology. It is about making people live better, to improve standards of living. So salaries, wages, it is impossible to describe something more difficult to understand than the current wages structure in Cuba. But teachers and health sector workers got an important improvement in their salaries. People that are working the land, that are making the land produce, and are supplying food, those cooperativists are over 100,000 more cooperativists now than a year ago. So, state land in Cuba in 1991 was 85% of the land state, 15% private farmers. Today, if you add 15% of farmers plus cooperative land, you have 65% of all productive land in the hands of farmers and cooperatives, not the state. So that is, to me, an important change. And that proves that cooperatives is a model that could be transferred to other sectors of the Cuban economy. This is why I think this is the most important measure. And that tomorrow, according to the Cuban Constitution, tomorrow, without changing anything in the Cuban Constitution, that cooperative system could be used, could be implemented in the social service and small manufacture. And small enterprises, private enterprises also could be approved. The problem with those changes is that it is supposed to have a new blueprint for the Cuban economy, which is not there. We were expecting that for the end of this year, for the Party Congress, but the Party Congress was postponed because of the critical economic situation, the global financial crisis, and the 2 hurricanes that hit Cuba last year. So this is a sort of up-the-hill situation for reformers, for people that want to change. But I would say that those are the most important ones. I think that the message Cuba has sent to the United States administration is a serious message of peaceful negotiations, of constructive negotiations. And they have just opened Revolution Square to the huge musical event with over 1 million people. That is accepting a challenge, and that is symbolically important, as long as symbols are important in politics. So far, this is what I can say. I think that most of changes are still to be implemented.
Can I follow up on that? So take one of the critical problems you talked about, housing in the cities. Is there any way of solving that problem that doesn't involve creating some kind of private property market?
Well, if you ask that question to an ordinary Cuban living in a popular neighborhood, they will tell you, what I need is the material, the construction materials, and let me repair my house. What I need is to know whether there's a group of constructors, of construction workers that work on a private basis that I could hire legally. And where could I buy that at prices that are affordable for me, that I am a poor worker? No? My income is not in convertible pesos or in euros or dollars. And I don't have an uncle in Miami sending me money. I have only my salary. That's what they will answer. And I agree with him. Rules of the game are clear and distinct. There is a Cuban constitution and there is a set of laws. The question is whether players want to play with those rules. You can always adopt the decision not to play. But I think that the vast majority of Cubans want to play with using those rules to improve the game. The game is the Cuban society, the country where they live. And not being dependent of people that leave Cuba and send money back. Not being dependent on remittances or on their own work. That has to do with people's dignity. And of course, there's always the choice of not playing with the rules of the game and not playing the game and leaving the stadium. But I think that the vast majority of Cubans don't want to do that. They would like to travel around, but to stay in Cuba playing that game. And I think that the question of winners and losers, which is to me the key question of this metaphor, that you don't have to take literally, because maybe you are going to ask me who's the pitcher, who's the catcher, second base, the fielders, etc. How many blacks in the game, etc. No? I think that the key question is winners and losers. I think that losers are there because they believe that they may win. When you look at the lower strata of the Cuban population, of the Cuban society, you will find a lot of complaint, but a lot of allegiance too. They don't want to leave Cuba. They want to stay. And they think they deserve to live in a better society, with more opportunities for them. And again, it depends on who are you talking to. If you talk to a young professional, 30 years old, or you talk to a black mechanic that has like 3 jobs, or a heart surgeon, or a farmer, a tobacco grower. Cubans have many people. So it is not fair to reduce them to the 9 players of a game. But they are all playing in different ways. They are all playing.
I was just wondering, I just got back from Havana, where I lived for 2 years, and I went to some of the monthly debates that you held with Temas. And so I want to ask, and also for this group, if you could talk a little bit about censorship and criticism and public speech and freedom of expression, because nonetheless, like, I think most people would agree that there's increasing room for critical debate. But ironically, the most recent documentary on baseball Fuera de Liga was in fact censored for 5 years. Spaces such as yours provide really excellent spaces for public debate, but I think most people feel that Havana and they are still, largely not spaces for open debate and discussion. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more from you, what signs of increasing productive public debate you see and where that's happening.
That is always a fight. You don't like fighting, don't do that. Find another job. I'm talking about your question. If you want to contribute to the debate and to expand the room for controversy, for ideas, for critical analysis, serious analysis, considering serious analysis not just personal opinions, but something with arguments and some basis. To do that it requires to make an effort and to invest a lot of time and energy, because no one is coming to tell you you can say this or you cannot say this. This is your work. It is like working the land for a farmer, trying to withdraw as much as possible, to bring and to take as much as possible out of that. And I think that what is to me a gratifying job, that make this a gratifying job, it is that a lot of very different people, old people, young people, poor people, wealthy Cubans, Cubans living in Cuba, Cubans living abroad, write to our magazine and tell us that they like what we are doing. And I always tell those who disagree that I don't agree with many articles we publish. But I think that our job is that one. And to open up and to expand the space, not just of freedom of expression, but of critical thinking. There's a lot of critical thinking in Cuba. The potential for that is huge. We have a very well-educated population. You wouldn't believe the readers of this academic magazine I found. This is not my merit. This is not the merit of those who publish the magazine. This is the merit of the players of the game, those who are out there reading. And we get letters that are impressive from not intellectuals exactly, that think that this is interesting. It is very interesting because the kind of problems we are dealing with. I have never, talking about censorship, I have never wanted to publish an article and I couldn't. Sometimes I had problems. Sometimes I had to spend time and energy in doing it. But that is worthwhile. This is what it is about. I think this is most valuable when this is something that you conquer than something that you are given. And there are other editors in Cuba I talk to. There are many other journals, many other reviews, magazines that publish about the Cuban society. Everything in Cuba is politics. Sometimes I meet people in the government who tell me, from time to time you should deal with a subject that is not so political. And I tell them, tell me what is not political. No? Raising fishes? No? Raising cookies? We are going to talk about Cuban sweets? Let's talk about that, and after 15 minutes, that we will have a political debate. Believe me. So that happens.
Can I ask, do you have any thoughts about why, because I agree with you, why is everything in Cuba political?
Because we are like that. Because Cubans are like that. Because Cubans that don't share socialist values or dislike Fidel Castro are exactly like that. Exactly like that. This is part of us. And we blame the Cuban media because the Cuban media politicize everything. I blame the Cuban media because they are boring. Not because they are politically, they develop political discussions. This is us. This is the way we are. So the Cuban atmosphere is politically overcharged. It is overcharged rhetorically. But we don't like that, of course. Who likes that? Speeches, that kind of speeches. Teques. The technical name for a boring political speech in Cuban slang is teque. No Cuban likes teques. But we are all very political. This is part of us.
Well, we have, I see 6 or 7 questions. Let's see if we can keep them brief to see if we can get them all in. So maybe you go next if you can brief it, and then we'll try to see if we can get them all the questions.
Well, I think you're right about Cubans being more political, and I think it's because in Cuba there was a revolution in 1959, and the people still have control of that revolution. And one thing that has always struck me, so they're more involved in politics than most people in this country who have no confidence that they can be involved in politics. But in Cuba they are. But my question is this, Cuba has always struck me as a very internationalist country. And that's what the Cubans, since 1959, have always said is their future. Is finding allies, in the face of the economic blockade from the United States and all that. And they championed the Vietnamese Revolution, the Nicaraguan Revolution. They helped defeat South African apartheid in Angola. They sent hundreds of thousands of volunteers in medical brigades and teachers and other experts all around the world in dozens of countries. And that is the future, I think, of the Cuban Revolution. It's based on that Cuba can succeed in doing what you want to do. And I wondered if you could just say some words about that question.
Well, the challenge, I think today, is that for those who are old enough to remember all that, may agree with you, for those who were told about that, who didn't live through all those years, who are less than 40 years old, and didn't experience what the revolution was, how do they get involved if it is not given them more room to participate and make decisions and be in positions they deserve to be? That is a key question to me, the question of relevo. What do you mean relevo in English?
Background.
Eh?
It's sort of generational transition.
You don't have an English word for relevo. Wonderful. change the pattern. No?
Yes, a relay.
Well, the question is not just to change. No? When you are in a relevo race, changing the baton. The question is that the new one is going to run in a different way. And maybe it's going to change the baton. And maybe it's going to do something different with the baton. And this is what not always all generations understand. Not always. Sometimes they do. I think that Cuba has been exposed to international influences always throughout 500 years of Cuban history. So this is part of us. It is always part of. It is also part of us to receive people, to welcome people from abroad, to be in tune what is going on in the world. And of course, it is true that the Cuban media are not good enough to supply information. But that doesn't mean that people are not informed. This is a crazy idea. They are very well informed. They turn on the radio, they go on internet, they talk to each other, so they know very much about what is going on in the world. But the very fact that they are eager to know more, I think it's a sign of public health. They are not satisfied with that. And I think that they have good reasons. Because the media should provide better information to everybody than they do. Even journalists, even people working in newspaper, think like that. But I think that to be aware of what is going on in the world is also part of Cuban civic culture. It has always been. And I think that I agree with you, the revolution emphasized that, not only emphasized. I think that that was part of the Cuban cultural tradition before 1959.
Okay, let's see now. I know, so the lady in the back, it's just, we have, I think, 5 more questions now. So you first, then I think Dane was second, you third, Patrick fourth, and Luis, and then we close it. And please keep it brief because we have a time limit. Thank you.
Okay, you mentioned tourism, and I'm just wondering if you could speak about the dual currency economy and how that fits into your understanding of this transition.
Aha, that's a good question. Particularly to answer in 1 minute. I don't, listen, Cuba has not enough hard currency to import. All Cuba needs to import. Why Cuba needs to import so many things? That's the big problem. It is impossible right now to use hard currency as the convertible peso, which is our hard currency, as the only money in Cuba. Because the Cuban economy cannot resist that. So all Cuban economists you can talk to, and even normal Cubans, will tell you that to have 2 currencies is crazy. But it is supposed to be an emergency instrument, monetary instrument, to deal with a situation that is temporary. So this is something that is not consistent. No? It is something that it's like that because there's no way to have it changed. But you don't have to convince the Cuban government that we should have only 1 peso, not convertible peso currency circulating. So it is a complex question. And talking about tourism and all the financial problems with tourism is also more complex than I would be able to articulate in 1 minute.
Well, we will have a little reception afterwards, so hopefully these are also conversations I think we can have.
Yeah. My question may be too complex too, but in the constitutional reforms of the 1970s, great effort was made to suppress the formation of political parties, but to encourage local, regional government. Is local or regional self-government an issue anymore?
It is one of the key issues. To make the Cuban institutional, the state institution, political institution, the popular power, to make it work the way it is supposed to work, according to the 1976 Constitution, and according to the reform 1992 Constitution. If we cannot do that, so we will have a real problem with the Cuban political system. So the key question, why the question of a multi-party system is not a priority in the Cuban internal agenda? Because the current political institutional system has to be tested. The Cuban Communist Party and the Cuban popular power must work the way it is supposed to work according to the Constitution. And there is a debate about that, to make the popular power more popular and more powerful. To be able to control the administration, to be able to control the bureaucracy, not only at the local levels. The local levels, popular power works not that bad. The question is not only the local level, but has to be improved the ability, the capacity of the popular power structure to really implement decisions and to be respected and use the power, to have the political power. But all the other levels until the National Assembly. The National Assembly is the top political organ of the Cuban state. It is not playing the role it's supposed to play according to the Constitution. Really. To make it work the way it is supposed to. This is why the political agenda, in terms of making democracy work, is to make the country function in a way the Constitution says. If that is achieved, we will be very democratic, even with this one-party system. I want to reserve that question. No, I don't want to discuss about that.
Yeah, well, I got the point you made about the impact of the global economic crisis and the two hurricanes that hit Cuba last year, literally back to back. And the impact that's had on Cuba, I think is very important because I know that the price of nickel, the two exports of Cuba are nickel and sugar, and both of those commodities, the prices have plummeted. But I think it's important because you also mentioned that there's still open discussion in Cuba. There's open discussion about the challenges that Cuba faces, and the government encourages this because the government is working. It's a much different, it's hard, I think, for us in the United States because it's a much different kind of society. You know, the fact that they have Social Security and have increased Social Security. Everybody has food. There's no homelessness in Cuba. You know, and this is within a growing global economic crisis. The other thing I think, to me, that inspires me about Cuba is the fact that even with the impact of the economic crisis on their country, they are still able to send doctors and teachers all over the world. They're very proud of this, and in many of the poorest countries in the world, I know one of the countries that Cuba sent doctors to was I think Pakistan, where they had a very bad earthquake. And the Cuban doctors went to some of the worst areas that people wouldn't go to. They send doctors to Venezuela. It's very well known, and I think it's something, you know, I don't know if you know much about this, but I think it's very important about Cuba and their solidarity.
I think that the most important source of wealth in Cuba is not sugar, is not nickel, it's the Cubans, the people. I don't like to use the term human capital, but it is the human capital.
Yeah, I'll make my question very brief. In your presentation, you outlined a series of problems, and then, if not solutions, then at least parameters for finding solutions to those problems. And you made it seem as if there's almost a consensus that exists about the nature of those problems and the solutions that would address them. So my question then is, which sectors in society oppose those changes? And if there aren't any, then why aren't those changes happening more quickly?
When I talk about consensus in Cuba, I try to describe the heterogeneity of consensus. What I mean that there's a consensus, I don't mean there's agreement about the solutions. And I think that you can hardly find anyone in Cuba that could tell you, I agree with everything that is going on. So this is not the kind of consensus that exists. There's always disagreements. But what I was trying to portray is a consensus that today is much less unanimous than it used to be. Sorry. Much less unanimous that it used to be. This is part of the rules of the game today. That you can disagree openly, and that though that disagreement has a much more a larger space. I think that solutions, if you have the time and discipline to sit down for 5 hours in a Cuban meeting where you have a discussion going on the problems, you will find solutions that are opposed, that are contradictory solutions. No? And those solutions, for instance, I was talking about cooperatives, but there are voices that are against cooperatives. I was talking about private enterprises, but there are voices against private enterprises, and that is expressed openly. I was talking about expanded, a larger room for critical debate, but there are people that disagree with the idea that we could be that critical, because there's the enemy, no, the threat, the United States that is there, waiting, no, because that disagreement is expressing for the United States, according to that point of view, weakness. And that is expressed also publicly. But I think that we should not underestimate a sort of conservatism that is popular. If you are 65 years old, if you are 65 years old in Cuba, and you are told that there will be radical changes in the Cuban economic system, there's a lot of people that are afraid of that couldn't agree, because they know that maybe the benefits for them, not for the 20 years old young entrepreneurs, but for them, the benefits for them maybe is not that much. So they don't feel like sure. So socialism, I thank you for your question. Socialism creates its own conservatism. The idea of let's keep up social achievements. Socialism and the revolution is about keeping the social achievements or about changing? Is the revolution about maintaining what we have reach or about changing and trying to reach new goals. There are always a risk involved in trying to reach new goals. So I learned, talking to different kind of people in Cuba, not only to decision makers or to experts, I've learned that there are people opposed to reforms and changes that are ordinary citizens. And they have good reasons that I understand.
Okay, there are many more questions. Hopefully we will continue informally after this. Let's first thank you for visiting the University of Chicago, and then hope that you can come back often, and that we can make these kinds of conversations a much more regular part of our exchanges. Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you.